And now this keynote will be just about that public acceptability of reforms, understanding what really matters to the people. So public acceptability is central to the success of ambitious policies, of course, as we have seen it, whether they aim to tackle aging and climate change or address inequality and digital transformation or pension reforms, for example, as we had the very hands-on example in the last panel. This keynote will explore how perceptions, attitudes, and social norms influence public support and examine how the new OECD tools such as Risks That Matter and Drivers of Trust surveys offer valuable insights into the demand side of policy making, which has to be taken into account as well. It is a pleasure to have her here on stage. Please give her a warm welcome, Romina Boarini. She's the director of the Center for WISE of the OECD, which focuses on well-being, inclusion, sustainability, and equal opportunity. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much to the organizers for the invitations, but also for bringing us together around this very, very important topic. So what I'd like to do today is to continue, I think, the topic that has been, of course, discussed this morning, and talk about data as very important tools for enlightening the policy debate, for designing sound public policies, but also for building consensus. So I'm going to highlight this last one, which is perhaps the element that has been discussed the least so far. So I'm coming from the OECD WISE Center. So this is a very young center which was created by the OECD only 5 years ago. One sort of key feature I want to highlight here is the fact that the mission of the center consists in generating new data and new tools, but also try to turn the data and the metrics and the evidence into action. So when I look at the program of this conference, I thought that the spirit actually of the conference really resonates very well with what the OECD WISE Center is trying to do. We're building on a long tradition of statistical and economic work and analysis that the OECD did for many, many years on topics that revolve around moving beyond GDP, inequality, inclusive growth, sustainability. So topics in a way have always been analyzed by the OECD, or let's say for many, many years. But what we're trying to do here is to just move from the simple evidence to actually do something with the evidence. And the focus on my presentation today is going to be public acceptability indeed, which is a very, very important challenge. I think we heard this morning a number of interesting stories around, what is public acceptability, how policymakers, governments understand public acceptability. And so that was really sort of the starting point of our thinking in the OECD. And of course, the OECD, if you're familiar with what the organization does overall, it essentially works with governments to advise governments. So it does a lot of analytical thinking and work in terms of sort of conceiving, designing a good reforms, right? And into that, a lot, I think, of the basic thinking again that sort of is behind this good reform is around thinking reforms, as possibilities to become more efficient. So it's really sort of centered on this idea that we're going to call something good if this is raising the efficiency of the economy, of the way, resources are allocated in the society, whether, this is making sort of the overall functioning of the economy or the society more efficient. That is, of course, very important. However, when we're talking about policy decision and reforms, so, sort of deep policy changes that are going to influence peoples, there are a few more dimensions that need to be understood and actually embedded into the design of policies. And that's really I would say, the origin of this work at the OECD. So we, of course, also think in terms of efficiency, but we try to add a bit more of materials and components that are closer to the way people would perceive the effects of reforms, the way they would understand the fairness of a reform, the way they would look at the process through which reforms are designed and then, implemented. And so this, I think, core aspects really sort of motivate the work that we have done here. A lot of work was already done a few years back in the OECD looking at the political economy of reform. And so I'd say that part of what I'm going to discuss today and present to you today really builds and leverages, those sort of, let's say, lessons from this earlier work. And already, I think that earlier work actually underscored the importance of transparent policy decisions and policy discussions around reforms. And I think, the word transparency and sort of using data in a very clear, open manner, making those data accessible to the wide public when a reform is conceived. These are all, in fact, topics and I think core points that were made by the speakers this morning. There is a lot of evidence actually that suggests that when governments do that, don't do that, so they actually introduce reforms very quickly, what people call a sort of stealth approach, so don't go public, very, very open about it, those reforms are going actually to fail. And there is also a lot of evidence that was collected by the OECD previously that actually suggests that the dynamics and the longer time horizon through which sort of reforms sort of produce and unfold actually are very, very important to consider. There is always the danger that some of the reforms may be halted or even sort of reversed. And so really one has to sort of look at this as a much sort of broader process and thinking as a reform as something that you need to introduce with a lot of careful sort of thinking, not just thinking, but actually an important process where you can get people on board. So I would say ideally you would have more than 2 weeks to do that. So I think what we heard this morning from Elsa Fornero was pretty interesting in terms of having this very tight deadline. This is not necessarily ideal to actually conceive and implement good reforms. So here, it's a report that we published based on this analysis, and actually the report did essentially two things. First of all, it started by a very specific case, a case study of reforms that are introduced, implemented by countries to reduce inequalities. And the reasons why we did that is because actually in the economic literature, the issue of how people understand, perceive inequalities, their drivers, but also what motivates the policy preferences for reducing those inequalities is actually the best understood. So if you again, look at what economists, political scientists, I think they've done also a lot of work. But, we started from the economic literature, and we actually thought that this was really the area, so inequality was really the area where we understand a little bit better how people think around perceptions of inequality, and again, what then that means for supporting policies that can reduce inequalities. That's the first part of the report. The second part of the report tries to draw lessons from this very specific case study on inequality and generalize some of those lessons to other types of reforms, so to other sort of policy areas. And we cover, for instance, climate change policies, some climate change policies, but also some pension reforms as being other sort of cases sort of analyzed. So in order to produce this work, we created an expert group. We wanted to do two things. First of all, not just use the OECD expertise, which is very important, and certainly very thorough and very extensive, but nevertheless, we wanted, of course, to reach out and bring in also a number of other stakeholders and other expertise. But the other important thing was try not just to have economists. I'm an economist, but I think that especially when it comes to understanding how people behave, with new reforms, we really need to bring in other disciplines. And so we had in this expert group some psychologists, we had some other type of social scientists, and importantly, we of course also had a number of representatives, including from national statistical offices, which is one of our main partners in the OECD-wide center. The reason why we did that, and this is an element that I'm going to highlight a lot as I discuss further this presentation, is because actually the statistical community, internationally and nationally, have really invested a lot in building new data. And in particular, what we call the perceptual data and the behavioral data. So these are essentially type of data that really tries to understand some of the subjective factors that are related to the understanding of inequalities, the beliefs in terms of what shape inequalities, what are the sort of the basic drivers of inequalities, but also, of course, all the sort of behavioral data, and behavioral data not always, and I would say even very rarely, collected by national statistical offices, although there have been interesting examples, including in Luxembourg, actually. But this is new, I think, type of resources that, we're trying, of course, to promote in the OECD, and so for us it was important to make sure that, the voice of the statisticians was also very well represented. Part of the work that we did, was once we had sort of a very strong analytical framework, also try to understand how you go about populating it. So I'm going to give you some examples in terms of essentially the data that we started collecting ourselves in the OECD, but also the ones that we are sort of promoting for further collection by national statistical offices. So in the first part of the report, as I mentioned, we look at the issue of inequality. And again, I said that there is at least sort of a stylized economic model according to which people understand and see inequalities. They have relatively good perceptions. Of course, there can be some measurement sort of biases in that. It's not perfect, but they globally understand what is inequality. And usually the position sort of towards reducing inequality really depends very much on whether of the very specific income class or group they belong to. Okay, so that's the very standard basic sort of model that essentially is assuming that you're making self-interested decisions, that this is the only thing that matters. So you would, be in favor of redistributive policies only if, of course, you consider yourself as a possible recipient of those policies, and vice versa. You would sort of oppose those type of policies if you rather sort of think to be, in the group of the best off. So that's the very basic models. It works, but not so much. And of course, there's been a lot of, economic literature that question and challenge that. I don't want to go there. But why it is a problem, apart from, let's say, limited conceptual relevance? Actually, it is a problem because when you start asking to people about, whether they understand inequalities really well, the very first, I think, data that or answer you get is that it depends on which inequalities you're talking about. And actually, a very crucial difference that people are making is between inequality of outcomes and inequality of opportunities. And people have a good understanding of both, and they have a quite clear view or preference, let's say, for addressing inequality of opportunity. So inequality of opportunity, in a way, is a concept that attracts, I would say, a lot of consensus, okay? If you start asking the questions about, do you think that inequality is too large in your country? Do you think that it should be lower in your country? Then you get a lot of very different answers. Now, the problem is that when the surveys that have been collected actually to look at those questions show that the views around inequality have become very diverse and different in OECD countries. And in particular, actually, it used to be the case that you could map those views very easily into the socio-economic characteristics of people. So you would say, well, if this group, has that income level, that educational level, is living in that place, well, we can predict pretty well, the view of inequality and, the policy priority around inequality. That has changed dramatically, as this chart shows. And in fact, there is, in many, many countries, a growing gap between those that actually believe that income inequality is high and those that believe it is low. And in fact, no more than 10% of the total dispersion in perception of inequality and social mobility can be explained by socio-economic groups. In fact, most of the variance in that dispersion is explained about differences within the same groups. Now, what that means is that it's very, very hard for governments and policymakers to understand what people think about inequality, but also, to, in a way, understand the expectations around reduction in inequality. And it's very hard, therefore, to actually build coalitions among groups, borders, etc., and derive or design and think of a policy that can be consensual, precisely because there is that very diversity of views. So this is the reason why we had to enrich the basic self-interested economic model, and we had sort of to integrate and embed other dimensions. I'm not going to sort of present in detail because I really have limited time. But there are just a couple of perhaps key characteristics that I want to highlight in this new framework that we have developed together with this expert group. First of all, sort of greater psychological realism and linked to the contextual factors. It's very interesting that the way people perceive inequalities very much depends on the type of information, of course, that they have, but also the type of other very local circumstances and the moment in time where you ask the question, the other big problems they're thinking about. So this has been added to some extent to that model. But we also had the society element, so essentially trying to understand, again, besides sort of the self-interest of the individual, trying to understand what are the attitudes towards others people, towards society, so what people usually call the social contractual dimension. So from that analytical framework, what we did is we started working to understand what are the priorities from a measurement perspective. So what would be the data that you need to collect to actually, really map this additional social contractual dimension. And I think the moderator mentioned two surveys that the OECD has developed in relationship to that. One is called the Risk That Matters survey, and the other is the Trust survey. And in different ways, but both surveys tries to really sort of comprehend and measure better that social sort of contractual dimension. I think I'm going to go on this one very, very quickly. What this slide says is that actually it's not so easy, of course, and it's not that you can just get one data set or sort of one piece of information to inform all different type of analysis, so policy priorities. So it's very much, a function of the type of policy reform that you want to enact. And perhaps this is not so surprising. But for instance, if we're talking about redistributive policies, then the type of questions that you need to ask to individuals are very much related to about the causes and drivers of inequalities. And there are people that think this is structuralist, so there have been sort of big societal systemic factors that shape inequalities, and others think this is all about merit and talent. But if, for instance, you are looking at some other type of policies, for instance, mutual insurance, the welfare state, then in this case, you have to understand much better the social contractual dimension. So, you know, whether people believe into reciprocity, so really think about the provision of the welfare system and the welfare services, you know, as a way sort of to give something back, or, you know, and to, in a way, hold the promise of social contract about sort of duties, but also duties, rights and responsibilities. So it really depends on the type of policies that you're considering. Now, the other big tool that we developed through this work is the public acceptability tool. And this is essentially a framework where we are bringing together some elements that exist from economic literature, but also other type of a literature. And we are trying sort of to articulate, again, what are the main components that for us underpin the notion of public acceptability. So, and essentially what we are saying is that sort of public acceptability depends on a number of factors. Public acceptability, of course, needs to embed a very important element that relates to the economic case of reform. So, you know, whether that reform is going to create an efficient outcome, whether this is going to be effective. For instance, if I take the example of carbon tax, you know, efficiency and effectiveness, of course, relates, you know, to the ability of any sort of tax to sort of reduce, you know, CO2 emissions. So that is one important component, but there are two more components actually that matter very much, and this is really sort of the added value of this work. The first is the equity fairness component. Other speakers this morning talk about the importance of looking at, you know, the distributive or distributional inputs of policies. We know that obviously, you know, policies may have effects that are very skewed and very diverse, and even across the population. So that's really, really important. Not always, when reforms are conceived, you know, those distributional considerations are actually embedded, despite the fact that, as this morning, you know, many said, the data exists and scenarios exist, but this is not necessarily the number one thing I would say that is put forward. Fairness really matters to people, so you really have to, you know, very, very clearly spell out what it means for different, you know, groups in the populations, for the different generations, for the different territories. And then, of course, I think the tricky question is, there are so many dimensions of fairness, you know, that you can think of. You know, how do you actually prioritize and identify the most salient in any sort of public policy debate? But the third element, which I think is the one that perhaps was covered, you know, the least this morning, is, you know, the process element. The procedural justice consideration. And that essentially relates to, you know, the way any government structures the decision-making process around any given reform. Of course, always, you know, this starts, you know, with, you know, good technical considerations. And those technical considerations, again, look at efficiency or equity. But the problem is that, you know, those technical considerations actually do not suffice to get the consensus and actually to get the, you know, the buy-in of the populations. And the reality is that what really matters to get people on board is to make sure that people understand what you're doing, and that you are able to articulate, you know, that process in a very, very inclusive manner. So, what we try to do with this, public acceptability tool is to have sort of a general framework that in a way provides this sort of checklist of questions, you know, what policymakers should look at, what type of data, you know, and in this case there are some, you know, elements that speak more to the perception, some to the factual. Another aspect that we highlighted in this framework is the behavioral dimension. And again, this is not always very clear when a reform is conceived, that the behavioral element of it has been sort of deeply considered. But you can think of any type of policy. I mean, the pension reform, you want to move the system, you know, from a pay-as-you-go system to, you know, a fully funded system or to a private system. This is based on the assumption that, your economic agents, your citizens are going to adhere to the new system, they are going to save, they are going to not just accept, but actually, play the game that is, implicit in that new system, right? Same for climate change policies. You're introducing subsidies for renewables, electric cars. Very good, but you need to make sure that actually people understand the importance, of those measures, that they actually want to change their behaviors. So that behavioral dimension is one that this framework is underscoring very much, and again, one that we do not see very often in the actual decision-making that underpins the policy reforms. So we did some special I would say, analysis of distributional impact assessments, and that was actually in the context of, and sort of how distributional impact assessment, which is essentially, a set of tools that a lot of economists are using. Many were mentioned this morning, micro simulations, etc. So this is obviously gaining traction, and so we sort of in that work. Especially when, of course, we were talking about the fairness dimensions of the public acceptability, we look at the strength of the existing distributional impact assessment models. That was done in the context of an exercise that Europe was running, and it was related to the discussion on social investment and looking at how different types of policies actually produce benefits for some groups in the populations. And one of the important conclusions of that European exercise was to say that those little models, or distributional impact models, exist, but actually are not mainstreamed sufficiently enough. That was the number one conclusion. The second conclusion is that very often they are actually not integrated within the broader macroeconomic policy. So, you have macroeconomic policy decisions that are taken, on the one side, and then, the other type of policy decisions, labor or social policy decisions that, are actually based on another type of tools. And so part of this work, was trying to look at this question as well. How do you actually establish a case in terms of economic efficiency and equity, but try to bring together those different set of tools that have been developed by different analysts. So I think I'm not going to go into the details of that, but one interesting case study I want to give, because of course, we look at the actual use of those distributional impact assessment tools in countries, not just OECD, because in this work we also had actually representative from the World Bank. And it was very interesting, that representative came with a very interesting example of some energy subsidies in Malaysia. And this is shown in this chart, and you can see that in the right panel there is a picture that shows the design of energy subsidies, and you can see that this is clearly regressive. So it's actually the richer households that are enjoying a greater share of subsidies. The other side on the left, the other panel, the other chart on the left panel actually shows that if you, however, ask the question to the people, to the populations, people don't understand that. So, in fact, the majority of the people that were interviewed in Malaysia across all levels of income actually believe that the subsidies either benefit rich or poor, or merely benefit the poor. So that was an interesting study, because it essentially means that it's not just the technical exercise. You also need to do a very important job in terms of communicating. So if this is the perception, and in this case, the perceptions that people hold on the inputs of an energy subsidy is wrong, then of course, as a government, as a policymakers, your duty is also, to be able to show, what is the right answer there. Now, perhaps I'll conclude this presentation by talking about the case study of the French reform of pension. I think we were quite lucky, or perhaps unlucky, to actually develop this work and have those conversations in the expert group exactly at the time when the French government was working on enacting a reform of its pension system. And I have to say, actually, so I'm Italian, but I moved to France, I think 25 years ago. And actually, as a researcher, my first task there was actually to look at the features of the pension system in France. And the government at that point in time was already, in fact, looking at this, and it took them more than 25 years to move from the research to the actual steps for changing the system. Now, this is a story which is not part of the report. I'm just saying that it gives you a sense of the time that perhaps was wasted on this very crucial question. What we did in the report is we developed a tool which is called a social listening tool, and essentially this is based on some machine learning techniques. So it's looking at textual data used in social media, but also in the press, also text that was coming actually from the discussions in the parliament. And so we look essentially at how the story, the narrative around the case for the reform in the French system was being built by the government, but also how the public debate around that was changing. And it's very interesting to see that the government started actually to only use economic efficiency argument, which of course was a good thing to do because from a very, very strict economic perspective, the French system actually has to be reformed. And so, the two measures that have been introduced, which is the increase of the age of retirement, but also, the lengthening of the contribution period, these are very, very grounded, motivated economically. So the government also introduced some argument in terms of equity, but not that much. The problem is that the government didn't communicate about, so they talk a lot around the sustainability, the challenges of public finances, but they didn't have, that broader discussion in terms of how that reform, for instance, was aligned or not to the other policy changes that the government was contemplating or was already sort of putting forward. And importantly, actually, the government didn't, take sufficient time to engage, with the citizens. They did engage with the social partners, but in a way that was, sometimes criticized. And so this is shown in this chart that actually, that really, really literally tracked, the type of debate and what were sort of the keywords, the ones, the focal points of the discussion. So the initial discussion in the press and in the parliament was all around economic efficiency. And then people started to stop talking about economic efficiency. So essentially all the criticism, all the opposition, people, did a lot of strikes, 14 days in the street, it was all, really, really all over the countries, people were just saying, we don't agree, you got to listen to us. Nobody listened to them, and so essentially all the oppositions came precisely on this process dimension that was sort of largely sort of ignored. Now, we all know the story, or, we know how it ended. So, the government passed it, but it didn't pass it in a way, again, that was sort of very, very strongly sort of criticized to be, not the democratic way it should have been. So, and this is certainly, one area of reform where there is still a lot of fragility, and it's coming back right now. A new government has to look at this again. So, this is not a fair key. This is not, granted. And so it's an example of a reform that could have been done slightly better, perhaps, if that process dimension would have been incorporated from the very start. I think I'll leave it here, and thank you so much for your attention.